In the events of in the movie The Girl with All the Gifts, the future is looking pretty bleak for England. For reasons we are not yet privy to, children are being kept in cells and transported around completely strapped in wheelchairs. You see, outside of the complex are things known as Hungries. These are the people who have become infected with a certain form of fungus that has wrapped around their brains like ivy to an oak. In adults, it presents as an animalistic, completely instinctual driven beast who will attack anything that moves that they can smell or hear. Sight does appear to make some differences, but we will get to that later on in the video. But these kids for some reason are able to exist with their infections in a way that makes them almost 90% immune right up until they get hungry, which in that case, the fungal infection will take them over, and then they become really no different from the mindless adults. So in today's episode, we will talk about this movie that I probably should have watched, which basically completely and utterly falls in line with every hypothesis I came up with for in The Last of Us, ironically enough. But I'll also say that I did love this movie. Book came out in 2014, movie came out in 2016, but according to a tweet I put out, The Last of Us and The Girl with All the Gifts just happened to be a coincidental timing in an era when humans were completely obsessed with zombies. Also, if I sound a little weird, yeah, I kind of noticed that too. Over the last 4 or 5 days, I've been kind of hoarse. Wouldn't say cold, but sweating? It's been not a great time to get sick. Anyhow, we will be discussing the infection that they have, why the children appear to be immune, which should kind of dip into neuroplasticity in humans, and why adults don't share the same ability. Alright, let's get to it. As usual, there will be a timestamp up on screen. If you want to bypass a summary of this movie, well then aren't you just awesome, bro, who's seen every movie? I had no idea that this thing even existed, and I usually pride myself on watching movies. For everyone else, let's find out why we must really be testing out our species' ability to resist Cordyceps, considering we just kind of make tea out of it and stuff. We open up our story with a young girl counting in her cell. You can't hear it because it's usually just me blathering on about something, but trust me, she's counting. Soldiers begin banging on cell doors of the other inmates in the early morning to wake everyone up and get them into their restraint chairs. Melanie happily jumps into hers and begins to strap herself down where she can. The soldiers walk in with their handhelds pointed at her, which would probably make people feel a little uneasy, but appears quite commonplace for wherever they are. The children are wheeled down the corridor, to which the sergeant mentions how the private shouldn't talk to it. Strange, but whatever. The children are then lined up in a room with soldiers as a nurse walks in and begins to roll call them, taking preliminary metrics. After she's done, the real teacher walks in, Miss Justino, who begins her lesson of teaching the children. Melanie brings up how they never finished reading the story earlier, to which the teacher obliges and begins. They begin reading the story about Pandora's box, how all the evils were contained within, but also so was hope. Everyone is returned back to their cells for the day, and the children are fed worms. Delicious. The next morning, another doctor comes by with a logic problem, asking what number are you thinking about, and how do you figure out about Schrodinger's cat? You know, the usual things that you actually ask children. I mean, considering the kid had no prior knowledge of anything, she actually answers exactly how I would. She also picks the number 1 through 20, to which she answers 13. The children are then pulled back out, and number 13 is missing. Melanie is the only person that asks why 13 isn't in class. The teacher deflects by asking them to write a story, even though they don't know any, to which Miss Justino, motherly instincts, come over a little too hard, and she touches the top of Melanie's head. Soldiers burst in at this point, yelling at her, and then show her what can happen. The sergeant spits on his arm and then rubs it in, removing some unknown compound. Now, I have a slight issue with this scene, so they can smell our skin, but they can't smell like our spit and breath. I just don't get that. But we get our first sight as to what happens. The children start going haywire, trying to reach out and bite. The smell wafts through the air, activating the almonds of all the children as their eyes glaze over and they become much more bloodthirsty. Returned back to their cells, Melanie taunts the sergeant and is then left in her restraint chair as a result. The teacher eventually goes back to her cell and finds that she has been left like this, and she releases her, but apparently she's not wearing enough of the blocker, and Melanie has a freak out trying to bite her, but is able to warn the teacher before she fully transforms into a monster. The doctor shows back up to find the blocker gel on the ground and then questions Melanie. Melanie doesn't say anything, but then she asks if she will pick a number between 1 through 20. She now picks 4, and that just happens to be her number. Later on, her cell lights up from an unexpected visit from the soldiers later, and she is brought to the doctor. If it wasn't obvious already, the number she was picking would directly correspond to who was getting picked and biopsied. Moving up to the elevator and the outside, it appears as though the complex is being mobilized. The Hungries appear en masse outside of the gate, to which the military doesn't seem to have enough resources, so an emergency vaccine harvest is conducted on Melanie. The doctor tells her what's happening and then injects her to knock her out. She's about to scoop out some brains when they move her to the table, and then the teacher shows up saying that she is done with this. The doctor attempts to tell her that this isn't a normal surgery. She knows how to build the vaccine, but the teacher doesn't care and then breaks the phone and then gets some mace to the face. Definitely gonna need those eyes since the base is currently under siege. While they waste time explaining some nonsense, the Hungries have broken through the gates and they attempt to close the shutters. So Matt, pause it here real quick for me for a moment. Let's do a freeze frame. Okay, so let me ask you a question about a zombie invasion. Glass behind you, changing in light behind you. Do you A, keep your head on a swivel, making sure that those are friendly so you're not about to get eaten, or B, sit like a complete oblivious brainlet? If you chose A, then you're wrong because B is what alpha chads do. Very nicely done, nurse. The Hungries break through the glass before the shutters can close and then infect her. The doctor fights back but slices open her hand in the process, and that'll be a problem later. The nurse changes quickly, probably within about 30 seconds, and the doctor runs. All right, so slight issue here. She slices open her hand, and now you might be thinking, oh, well, she got the Hungry's blood on her hand, so she's gonna change. Actually, she didn't. So just know that. Anyways, moving on. Melanie wakes back up on the table and finds that the nurse is searching for anyone near her. She grabs a knife and then frees herself as the nurse licks blood up off the floor. Melanie exits the compound to find that it's all-out war on the surface. Hungries everywhere and soldiers dropping like Christmas ham on my plate in 7 days. She sees that some soldiers are punching the teacher and then takes them out with throat bites and lays down after as she eats their flesh. As she does, the teacher gets back up and grabs her. With her bloodlust satiated, she picks her up to carry her, but as she does, an armored transport runs down a few and she gets in. The doctor, soldiers, teacher, and Melanie all GTFO as everything devolves into total chaos. Driving far enough away from the base, the soldiers notice that Melanie is in the back and they release her. As they discuss what to do, the doctor mentions just putting her in the wheel well to where she gets smacked into next week by the teacher. As the doctor has mentioned before surgery, she actually thinks that these are just presenting as children, but are not actual children. They're simply driven by the fungus to be this way to get into a group of adults and infect, which the doctor and I are going to have to disagree on that one, but we will get to that later. So they decide to put her in the turret chair on top of the roof. Moving through the woods, they decide that they need to make a move through London to get to Beacon, which is a safe haven for the military. They move to get water to fill their canteens, and the sergeant said suppressors on, to which one soldier forgot. A cracking of the stick causes him to fire in that direction, which alerts all the Hungries in the woods of their location. They begin their attack, and they end up losing the scout soldier as a result, as his arm was bitten, and he quickly turns and the sergeant takes him out. Back in the armored vehicle, they wait it out, and as they do, they discover that the scuffle resulted in them hitting the fuel lines for the truck. So now they are on foot as they begin to trek through the woods. Moving through the outskirts of London, they take a look outside and they see hundreds within the city limits. Actually, scratch that. More like thousands of people, and they're just standing in place. It's densely populated, but it's the only way through. Not like they could have just, walked around London or anything. I'm pretty sure there's an outskirts of London, right? They slowly move their way through with the E-blocker and their suppressors on, and quietly as possible as not to alert the horde. As they are walking through, a lone infected is seen pushing her stroller through the crowd. Apparently it was the last thing she was doing before being infected, which may show that old memories or instincts exist. As she does, the doctor stops her and looks under the blanket of the baby and sees a rat is eating the kid, to which she gasps and it alerts a few members of the horde. And I break away to say this: a freaking suppressor is still extremely loud. I mean, you can still go deaf from those things. It's not as quiet as a whisper, and I kind of found it hilarious. Like literally that whole horde would be on them right now. Okay, so moving on. They're now alerting a few as they go along, but successfully get into a building for shelter. This building appears to have been a hospital of some sorts, specifically a maternity ward. And now we get some exposition on the children. As the outbreak continued, mothers of the neonatal babies were infected, and as they were, the children adopted the fungus through the placenta, which in turn infected the babies. When the mothers were found, they were emptied completely. Heart, lungs, intestines, everything on the inside was gone, and only the babies were left. They were eaten by the children and hollowed out. This eccentric root, as said by the doctor, is why she does not believe these things are human and instead completely driven by the fungus. Melanie is informed that she was found the same way as well. As the hospital is cleared, they wait for morning to come and then see how they should proceed through the area. Hundreds of infected are in the street, which makes it virtually impassable. Melanie mentions how she can get through and find something to lead the horde away, considering they have no interest in her. They give her new clothes and then send her on her way to try to find a way to get the horde to move away. As she walks through, she is correct that they indeed do not care at all. She eventually gets out of the densely populated area and then finds a void kitty, which is sad because that's like Mrs. Mittens, which if you didn't know, Mrs. Mittens is my kittens. But she eats it, and this implies that it's not just human pheromones that are triggering the fungus, but quite literally all animals that exist. As she moves through an apartment, she finds a dog left over. She picks it up and then takes it back to the horde, which they smell it and then begin following it out of the area as the dog nopes out of there. Melanie shows back up, covered in blood to the disgust of everyone standing there, and they exit the building and continue on. Moving through an overgrown London, they eventually find roads that are completely unpassable again, again, but go with the same idea as before. Why fix what ain't broke? They give Melanie a radio and then tell her to report back when they find a more passable route. So she does, and then they walk through and they find what looks like the remnants of people in a group. They're all leaned against a street lamp with stalks coming out of their eyes and their faces. As they move deeper into London, they actually find more and more of these people until ultimately they come across a large tower with hundreds of them. This tower has something completely new, the second stage of the fungal life cycle. Pods can be seen all over the vines ascending high into the tower. This greatly alarms the doctor because if these burst, the fungal spores become airborne and infect that way, which would basically mean humanity is screwed. She says though that it's a bad design and then smacks it on the ground, which kind of seems like a bad idea to me, showing that they have no idea what it would take to open this pod. As luck would have it, however, they end up finding a mobile lab that has everything they need. The doctor by now is looking pretty sick and doses herself with antibiotics off screen. The sergeant tries to start the lab, but no luck. As they try to radio for Beacon, Melanie starts to feel it, Mr. Krabs, and requests to go be let out to eat after the private gets far enough away to go look for food himself. Melanie purposely runs the other way as to avoid the private and then looks for anything in the area. She ends up finding some birds and eats. As the private moves through, it's clear that there are children in this area and they're all feral. Melanie actually ends up running into a tribe of these kids and she watches them from afar, with one scout returning to inform the tribe that an adult has been found and they're not infected. They all take off as Melanie runs back, and it's clear the doctor isn't doing so hot either. She mentions how she got blood poisoning from the cut on her hand, and she requests that the teacher let her make a vaccine before she bites the dust, as the antibiotics are not working quick enough. The private finally finds a store and goes inside, but leaves his pack and radio because that's smart. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and tell you, things are a little dark in here. I know, it's just the movie. I don't know how to make this thing lighter, and I'm not really sure it's even possible, at least with the video editing stuff that we have. Melanie tells them that they need to go help the private now before it's too late, and they take off. But the private is basically screwed at this point. Those cans he found outside were traps set by the kids. A lone child is seen eating a rat inside, to which the private tries to help. As he moves in further, from what I can tell, the ligaments on his knees were cut to prevent him from running. He pulls out a grenade saying that he will blow them all up, but then he doesn't. And my guy kind of just gets his guts eaten hardcore. So hardcore, in fact, that when his rescuers show up, you can just barely make out the light reflecting off his spine. Ouchies. So this part, honestly, I'm not gonna lie to you, it kind of made me cringe. Exiting the shop, Melanie retorts that they're actually in a trap and find that the children are surrounding them. But since she's different, they don't immediately attack. She ends up yelling at them, which again, all I could think was, it just reminded me of this kid back in high school who would growl at people. Mega cringy. Just please do not ever be that person. Anyhow, she does completely beat the crap out of one kid with a bat who appears to have been the alpha, which we break away. How did all these kids survive? We will talk about that later. After completely annihilating the skull of the bat kid, the rest of the group were like, nah, I'm good, and back up. The teacher, sergeant, and Melanie leave the area unharmed as a result. Getting back to the lab, as they run inside, the air is poisonous. Now, sort of. The doctor is able to knock everyone out by flooding the interior with laughing gas or some sort of anesthesia, and as a result, they pass out. She drags Melanie off to the table to begin brain scooping, and then Melanie wakes back up. She mentions how she held her breath and doesn't have to breathe as much as everyone else. She would regularly actually hold her breath and count to 1,000 when she was in her cell. The doctor begins trying to reason with her, saying that if she wants the teacher to live, she needs to do this. Let her make the vaccine. Melanie obliges at first, but as the doctor continues to talk, sort of about how the spores and how they could be released, Melanie decides to destroy the threat instead. Now, this is just my interpretation. It looks like she's trying to destroy the threat. Maybe she's just like, screw it, dude, bring on the new world. Either way, things don't turn out too well. She locks everyone in the lab as the doctor gives chase, which is a bad idea, because the doctor's then eaten by the feral children in an almost pitch black scene. I know, it's dark. Melanie lights up the tower, and this is what it actually took. Not water, not sunlight, fire. The pods open, making the spores airborne as they drift and waft over the entire city. And the sergeant actually exited the lab to look for Melanie and the doctor, but at this point, he became infected by the airborne spores. She ends up taking him out at his request when he turns and then goes back to the lab. With the entire planet now screwed, it would appear that the children who have adapted the fungus are going to be the only ones left, as the air is now toxic to all adults who aren't currently infected. But with all evil things out of the box now, hope still does exist, as the teacher continues to meet with the feral children, with Melanie keeping them in line in hopes of teaching them. Stuck in the mobile lab, she can never leave and must get this generation up to speed on how to communicate, but humanity is definitely returning to monkey at this point, or optimistically, the Stone Age, which, if you guys didn't know, chimpanzees have officially entered the Stone Age along with orangutans. Just thought that was a little interesting side fact I would throw in there for you guys. With that summary wrapped up, the first thing we must cover is what are we currently under attack from, and how does this impact the species it's currently wreaking havoc havoc on, and how would this translate to humans? Well, the fungus we are currently dealing with in this movie is Cordyceps unilateralis, or just the Cordyceps fungus for short. This fungus is actually pretty insidious. For now, it appears to only infect insects. It gets into their heads, makes them clamp down on leaves high above the colony, to which a stalk will appear with a pod. This pod will burst, showering other ants in the area with the same cordyceps, which in turn takes them over and then cause them to do the same thing. The fungus has shown that it can annihilate entire colonies quite easily, and should ants be acting strangely who are infected but not yet presenting the stalks, other ants will actually quarantine them out of the colony if possible in an attempt to preserve themselves. Now, an ant is undoubtedly much less complex of an animal than a human, but if you attack the right areas, it's all really the same, just nerves and control of movement. Considering the cordyceps has shown that it can cause ants to move to a location that are favorable for the cordyceps and then clamp with the jaws of the ants as well, there must be not so much an understanding by the fungus, but simply patterns that have returned favorably and allowed it to flourish. Because for those cordyceps that did not use these patterns, they didn't make it as far. And you know what we call that? Evolution! Humanity in this realm of the girl with all the gifts is currently being ransacked by this population of cordyceps that has really learned how to interact with the human brain and the nervous system in a way that completely overrides the control that we have over our own bodies, which is so ridiculously easy, you'd ever wonder how animals even evolved. It all really comes down to just neurochemicals. Now, the timing of the neurochemicals is a little more difficult, but the fact is that you can flood neurochemicals in the body, it does produce effects. So if you affect the body's ability to release chemicals, and instead, let's say the cordyceps wraps itself around the brainstem of a person, it can actually take over, influence in a way how a person moves and interacts with the environment, or maybe doesn't interact with the environment. The cordyceps clearly in the brain is releasing a neurochemical of its own that is able to influence the actual motor neurons of a person, which may also explain why people are taken over so quickly by the fungus. So starting with newly infected adults, first thing I want to cover is infection time. So when the soldier gets infected in the woods, it took, what, 30 seconds, right? A bite to the arm. Why is that? This isn't like a fast-acting virus or bacteria, but that's exactly why it's perfect. This particular cordyceps is already adapted to the human nervous system, which coming from the specific points of the mouth region of the person who bit him is also perfect. The reason it is so fast-acting is after it enters the bloodstream, the fungus is then pumped all throughout the body. In fact, in hospitals, this is why any injection to knock you out reaches the brain in seconds. Once the cordyceps has reached the brain, likely is able to move past the blood-brain barrier and into the neural space itself. Once there, it's already releasing neurochemicals compatible with our own chemoreceptors. The jerky movement we see him doing is these new chemicals entering the brain and beginning to take control. This results in the sergeant taking the shot as he begins gnashing his teeth at him now. His meat suit is in full control of the cordyceps, or at minimum, mostly in control of the cordyceps. These presentations of symptoms likely only get worse from here. Well, it's not likely, they absolutely do get worse, because after you are newly infected, the cordyceps continues to flourish within your body. We see in the cities, people are almost borderline catatonic. Standing together, it's an interesting concept, which we will explain momentarily, but as they stand there, they're not moving. They just appear to be almost asleep, and here's why. With the cordyceps in control of the brain at this point, and the growth it's likely undergone as a result, the brain damage is assumed to be absolutely normal. During the initial phases of the brain being infected, it's still largely intact, and the person absolutely understands what's happening, but can't control their body. However, as the years pass and the fungus grows within the skull of this person, this puts pressure on the cerebrum of this person. As the pressure is applied, this would destroy the neural tissue that is extremely delicate. And this is why adults who have been infected for a long time do not appear to have higher thought, as we see with the person in the hospital. They're just sort of thrashing about and can't understand what happened to it or why it's stuck. This would imply that the frontal lobe specifically is completely necrosed, and this person that they once were is gone. That said, instincts run deep, literally. As we evolved over time, our brains grew outwards. This has resulted in something known as the lizard brain at our most core, and then you have the mammalian brain built outwards from that, and then primate, and then human, which obviously is us. The lizard brain houses all of our instincts for the most part. With the upper portions of the brain destroyed, this unbridled instinct is unshackled by logical reason, and the human is their most animalistic form, which comes to the surface. Eat and survive. And possibly socialization is still there, which is why they stand together. There's also another instinct in there, but the cordyceps would not need this to be done. But essentially, that's it. To which the cordyceps absolutely obliges to keep the person alive in a few ways. So you could actually say an adult human infected is in fact a symbiotic relationship to a degree, just not in a way that's beneficial to our consciousness, but beneficial to our bodies. I actually had this argument with my Last of Us video. I mentioned how it is really this relationship, and people kind of got bent out of shape about it. So let me present it this this way. If your body can survive and whatever makes you is not in the game, then were you ever really necessary? Multicellular organisms exist because it was beneficial to be together rather than separate. So remember that. Our consciousness, whether divine or mundane, is simply us surviving even better. If we can survive without our consciousness due to the addition of another species, then that by definition is a symbiotic relationship. Granted, I'd rather be in the driver's seat personally, so I would say don't go down in the comments getting upset over that. I mean, I will give you this, the Cordyceps that we know of in the real world is quite a parasitic fungus for insects, but that's because it results in the host's destruction, not their preservation, as seen in this movie with humans. It's clear to me that based upon the rust of the buildings, the overgrowth seen in the streets, and just the sheer state of the homes and city, that this infection took place a while ago, not to mention the ages of the children. Because of that, I can only come to the conclusion that while the consciousness of adults is destroyed, the fungus is keeping their bodies alive. Likely anyone who is newly infected in this state has nothing that they're going to be able to eat and will expire before the fungus is able to keep them alive or grow to the point that it might be able to keep them alive. And that might be what's surrounding the towers and the streets. Those still standing were likely infected early and were able to eat, allowing the fungus to grow and flourish to the point that it was able to keep them alive and their bodies fed. Now, this feeding at a certain point isn't sustainable. Again, like I mentioned in the Last of Us video, for a while, the addition of new meat broken down in the stomach would sustain our meat suits and the cordyceps, but eventually the cordyceps would be forced to break down the body that sustains itself. In this process, it would feed the body to the body, but there's only so many calories within us. Eventually, not even the cordyceps would be able to keep those infected alive, and they would drop like any other person. This would explain, however, why people are just standing there with their eyes closed, not reacting to the environment. They are in a vegetative state to not expend energy that they may not even have. And it's also possible that they're standing close together not because of just instinct, but they're getting ready to become one of these super nests. Now, all this was fine and good up until the mother pushing the stroller comes along. This person in particular appears different. Why is she moving when no others are? Well, I think it's probably because of the lizard instincts. Protect the young. Likely when she was infected, she was running with the stroller, and this drive was so strong that as part of her brain kept communicating to run with the child, it would do so even after the cordyceps took over. And that portion of the brain is likely still sending that signal to run with no information from the upper portion of the brain to communicate to turn that off, and this would have kept her moving until her eventual collapse. So with our decent understanding of what's happening to the infected and why they're acting the way they are, how does the cordyceps respond to the environment? Well, in a few ways actually. Despite the hilarity with the silencers being quieter than a whisper, their ability to move through the area with all those infected could actually be feasible, believe it or not. With the cerebrum highly damaged, so too would their senses be. So the optic nerve runs on the interior of the brain into the back of the skull where the occipital lobe sits and interprets information. While most tissue is likely destroyed in the process of changing into an infected, this would make visual issues probably quite prevalent. Those that are moving through are not immediately recognized when the infected open their eyes because the visual information is processed slower or really not the same as you or I see. However, as we're about to get into heavily, likely the cordyceps interprets visual information as confirmation that something is there. It's not so much seeing, it's feeling. Concerning hearing, it's clear to me that the temporal lobes are actually probably more intact than most other lobes. Due to their lower positioning inside of our skull, this may have spared them. The cordyceps would likely use this area of the brain much more heavily as a result, which can interpret auditory signals. That said, it's specific sounds that it's looking for. Human sounds. Shots fired, light footstep noises, or a stroller being stopped aren't noises that the cordyceps is looking for. However, a gasp from the doctor awakens them because this may be also activating the speech recognition area of the brain, which these two areas brought back to their neural firing status. The cordyceps would sense this thing as a human noise. The big one, however, is the sense of smell. This area of the brain is likely completely preserved due to its location. The olfactory bulb of the brain is located under the frontal lobe of the brain above our nasal passages, and this would be spared from compression, but considering its proximity to the lizard portions of the brain, this area was likely heavily infested with cordyceps. So while our sense of smell may not be as, keen as other animals, we can still smell relatively well. People have been stated as saying that after somebody broke into their house, they could actually still smell them because things were different. We don't normally think that we can smell other humans, but actually we can discern smell quite well. And smell and well, I've already rhymed that like 5 times. There's actually a hypothesis that you may not like certain people for no reason simply because of how they smell. While you may not be picking up the scent of them consciously, like you're not like, man, you really smell terrible, your nose might actually just be picking up scents from them that are very minute, and this is triggering something within the brain's pathways and subconsciously cause distrust and just making you dislike them in general. And this really isn't that far-fetched considering we are men mammals, and it's clear other mammals ascertain information from others by smelling them. So as humans walk around without E-blocker, they're able to smell humans easily. But what is this actual smell? Well, it's clear to me that it isn't a pheromone, considering the infected will eat other animals as well. So they're not like just honing in on human pheromones. It's not sweat, because cats and dogs don't sweat, whereas humans do. It's not just our bodies either, because considering we have a gaping hole in our face that emits scent all the time, the fact is the infected are reacting to anything that may not smell like cordyceps. It's likely that the bodies of those that are already infected are putting off some sort of scent of the fungus, considering the presentation of the fungus on our skin. But also, considering that the children are containing their cordyceps infection, it's also likely sweat glands as well. And this covers the body in a scent that is unappetizing. And this is why humans must cover themselves in E-blocker. Melanie mentions how it basically just stinks really bad to her. However, if you know what E-blocker means, you are able to track it. The infected cannot reason that E-blocker means humans simply because the fungus doesn't have the ability to reason. So the fungus interprets the signals as just smelling bad, so no food here. The children, however, have frontal lobes, and while the E-blocker does smell terrible, they know it means that a living person, which the fungus is highly attracted to. This gives E-blocker sort of like a time limit that'll be effective, and it really won't be for much longer. So with the cordyceps using the senses of a person and how that's understood, we can now discuss the evidence that supports the symbiotic model and how the children were able to survive their infections. As we know, these neonatal children were found with the cordyceps already inside their bodies as they were growing. They ate the organs out of their mother and presumably just lay there. Some were found to have been brought back to be educated and understood in the military bases, but most of those were infected, likely in London, and were left to their fates. And yet, some children are seen. Now, there are a few possibilities. For instance, the mobile lab people could have taken all the children in London and then fed them and then did their own studies and then were eaten, but you know how ridiculous that sounds. So I'll just straight up present to you the timeline of events that really makes the most amount of sense. When the children ate, they were satiated. The fungus continued to grow inside of them and into their brains. However, at that age, there is something known as neuroplasticity. It's basically the brain's ability to map old abilities to new areas in case damage is to form. In children, it's absolutely viable, and this has led to some very strange things in our universe. For instance, a young boy who had a large piece of his brain removed at the age of 4 to stop his epilepsy, quite literally a third of his brain went on to be absolutely fine, like completely no loss of function. His brain simply remapped the old knowledge to new portions of the brain to share the load, and this is paramount to this whole argument. Portions of the brain were absolutely destroyed in babies as the cordyceps grew and continued to grow throughout their bodies. But as the children grew, more neurons were added and newer areas were mapped to do different things. Because of this, the cordyceps grew with the baby into being a toddler, allowing them to survive the process and remain cognitively intact. I would wager that if you took a brain scan and asked them questions that you would ask adults, entirely different areas of the brain would light up in response because of how differently they had to adapt. But as they continued to lay in their mother's empty abdomens, the cordyceps had the nutrition it needed and the body had the neuroplasticity it needed for both creatures to remain intact, and the symbiotic relationship kept them alive. In contrast, adults lack this ability to remap areas effectively. Because of this, when an adult is infected, once those areas are lost, they are lost for good, resulting in permanent brain damage. After a few months to years, the baby would eventually leave the abdomen and then find others who were like them, and then they formed this tribe. While infected, they were still human, and the issue is they never learned human culture, how to talk, how to behave, anything. So basically, they have successfully returned to monkey. Yes, I know I've used that joke before. In fact, absolutely insane people keeping their children locked up during crucial portions of their life where imprinting is taking place have left them unable to deal and interact with other people, and this has happened like real life. And that's why we see these children in this tribe basically shrieking and hissing at each other. They're feral. The fungus, however, is not totally relinquishing control. While higher thought is capable, it's pretty obvious that this fungus still has control over the motor neurons at certain points, with the brainstem being kind of conquered, as well as, the base of the brain in general. And concerning the hypothalamus, when hunger hormone ghrelin is released by the stomach under normal circumstances, this causes an activation in this portion of the brain. As a result, the cordyceps interprets this as its free ride is in danger of being lost. This activation, along with the olfactory bulb identifying the smell of humans, works in conjunction with one another, and this causes them to become extremely hungry and aggressive to find food, which likely results in the activation of the amygdala as well. And this is why you actually get hangry. We are animals after all. Hunger equals aggression, whether we like it or not. However, it seems that conscious choice is possible for those to quasi-override the cordyceps should they not be hungry. They can smell humans, but not react as aggressively in most cases, like when Melanie eats a soldier's neck, but doesn't eat her teachers. Or when she eats the cat and then is able to interact with the group as normal. When the stomach is full, the ghrelin myelin signal stops and the cordyceps is less activated. As a result, logical thinking can counterbalance instincts, thus causing the cordyceps to not activate as harshly by the neural signals. Okay, so wrapping this up, I didn't know whether I wanted to make a video or not on the quack known as Abby's dad in The Last of Us 2 or not. In the events of The Last of Us 1, at the very end, the doctor says that they need to remove Ellie's brain to make a vaccine. Well, in this movie, they need to do the same thing, and my God, who are these doctors? What they are trying to accomplish is, why are these children different? And literally anyone with a biology degree can tell you with a basic understanding of human anatomy and growth and development that both these doctors are complete idiots. Scooping out the brain of someone is completely unnecessary. A spinal tap, which would contain the cordyceps along with the immune system interaction with the cordyceps, would yield enough information that you need to understand why the body isn't reacting like the adults do, at least concerning The Last of Us. In this movie, it appears to be mostly timing, and I'll get to why it's mostly timing. If your skull has room to grow and neuroplasticity is still possible, the fungus won't destroy your brain. This part really bugged me because all the children are the same. They present the same, yet Melanie is supposed to be someone special when she really isn't. It simply boils down to, if there's enough room in the skull for the two entities, then they can exist. If there isn't, well, obviously the human element is lost, and if there is, this is the children. So the vaccine per se may not work. She says she can synthesize it, but if she's basing this off of like the children's immune systems, they may not be attacking the cordyceps because at the time of their birth, as we can call it, their immune systems were basically underformed and therefore likely never saw the cordyceps as a threat. This is kind of my whole thing on like why the children are able to exist and actually don't have the cordyceps attacking outside of their skin. The cordyceps may be responding to the body's natural immune system attacking it and basically launching a all-out assault on a human immune system and attacking it back and growing further, whereas the children are not attacking it, so that's why they aren't presenting it on the surface of their skin, because the cordyceps may not be growing due to the attacks from the immune system. But this would all be predicated on the fact that the body would have to assume that the cordyceps is naturally occurring inside of it. Now, since they are older, there may have been some sort of suppression, like because they're not trying to destroy it. So if anything, their immune systems are actually not going against the cordyceps, and there really may not be any antibodies attacking it continuously, whereas in the adults, antibodies are attacking, which means really immunosuppression would be how you would stop from being overtaken by this, but it would still destroy an adult brain. So what sort of vaccine would work? Well, you're probably not going to get it from a human because there's no possible way for you to synthesize something that doesn't exist that isn't there, or if it's from the wrong antibody in an adult. But there's nothing to suggest that this inoculation could even be done after all the doctor's biopsies mentioning how the fungus is wrapped around the brain. Melanie is not special. It is simply enough room in the brain and adaptation.